The evening was glowing with warm lights and gentle music as guests filled the hall. The chandeliers sparkled above like tiny stars, and the tables were covered with fine white cloth and shining glasses. Laughter and chatter filled the air. Everyone looked beautiful, dressed in fancy clothes, holding drinks, and exchanging smiles that sometimes hid quiet judgment. In one corner of the hall, a woman stood silently near a long piano placed at the center of the stage. She was not a guest. Her dress was plain, simple, and her hair tied neatly back. She worked at the hotel, arranging flowers on tables and making sure everything stayed perfect. She moved quietly, trying not to draw attention to herself. But something about the piano kept pulling her eyes toward it again and again. It was a grand piano, polished until it gleamed. Its black surface reflected the golden light of the chandeliers. The woman paused for a moment while walking by and gently ran her fingers across the edge of the instrument. It was as if a part of her heart lived inside that piano. She stood there longer than she meant to, lost in thought. A small group of guests noticed her. One of them, a man with a loud laugh and a glass in his hand, said to his friends, "Look, she's ready to give us a show." Everyone chuckled. The woman immediately stepped back, embarrassed. She gave a polite smile and lowered her head, pretending to busy herself with the flowers on the nearby table. But inside her chest, her heart was racing, not from fear but from a quiet longing. It had been many years since she had touched a piano, years filled with hard work, struggle, and sacrifice. She once spent her days surrounded by music, teaching children, performing at small community halls, and filling her life with melodies. But things changed. Life took turns she hadn't planned. As the evening went on, she kept working, though her eyes returned to the piano every now and then. The laughter of the guests didn't bother her. She had heard worse things in life. Still, something about this night felt different, as if fate had quietly planned something she didn't know yet. The guests continued enjoying themselves, their laughter echoing through the room. The music from the speakers stopped for a while when the hired performer failed to arrive. A few guests grew restless. "What happened to the music?" someone asked. "This party feels empty without it." The host tried to keep everyone happy, apologizing and promising that the performance would begin soon. Meanwhile, the woman continued her work, collecting empty glasses from the tables. When she passed near the stage again, she looked at the piano once more, just a short glance. But this time one of the guests saw her and said loudly, "Why don't you play something? You seem interested." Everyone turned to look. The woman froze. Her hands tightened around the tray she was holding. She forced a small smile and shook her head. "Oh no, I couldn't," she said softly, but the guest wouldn't stop. "Come on, it'll be fun. We need something to laugh at while we wait for the real musician," he said. Laughter spread through the crowd again, cruel but playful in their eyes. The woman felt her face grow warm. For a second she wished she could just disappear, but instead she stayed calm, nodded politely, and continued walking. She didn't respond, though inside she could feel a mix of sadness and courage building. She reached the far corner of the hall where the staff kept their supplies. Another worker noticed her expression and whispered, "Don't mind them. They're just showing off." She smiled faintly. "It's all right," she said quietly. "People see what they want to see." The night continued, but that small moment stayed in her mind like a faint echo. Every time she passed by the piano again, her heart whispered to her, reminding her of the person she once was, of the songs she used to play when life was simpler, before everything became about survival. Her mind drifted back to her younger days when her home used to be filled with music. She remembered sitting by the window, teaching her younger brother how to play small melodies. She remembered the joy on people's faces when she played in local gatherings. It wasn't fame or money that she wanted back then. It was peace, the feeling that she was doing something beautiful that touched hearts. But then came the years of struggle. Her husband had fallen ill and the bills kept piling up. Music couldn't pay for medicine. Teaching couldn't keep the lights on. She had sold her piano one winter evening to cover the rent. The day she watched it being carried out of her house was the day a part of her went silent. Now, standing in this fancy hall, surrounded by laughter and bright lights, she wondered if fate was teasing her, placing that piano right in front of her as if to test her strength. The event carried on. Waiters served food, music from the speakers returned for a while, and people danced. But as the night grew older, More guests noticed the quiet woman. It wasn't because of her beauty or her dress, it was something else. There was a kind of calmness around her, something they couldn't quite name. When one of the guests accidentally spilled wine on the tablecloth, she rushed over immediately, handling the mess gracefully and politely. The same people who mocked her earlier watched how kind and composed she was. There was no anger or frustration in her, just a simple, gentle way of being. Later, when the performer still hadn't shown up, the host tried to lighten the mood again. "Seems like our musician is stuck in traffic," he said. "Anyone here with hidden talent?" A familiar voice from the back shouted, "What about her? She was eyeing the piano earlier." Everyone laughed again. This time the woman didn't move. She stood still for a moment, holding a napkin in her hand. Then she took a slow breath. Something inside her said, "Maybe this is the moment." The host looked at her and smiled politely. "Would you like to play a short tune? Just for fun?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward her. Some looked curious, others amused. She hesitated. "I'm not sure I remember much," she said softly. "That's all right," the host replied kindly. "It's all in good spirit." She looked at the piano once more, the very instrument she had loved and lost. Her fingers tingled slightly. She placed the napkin on a nearby tray and walked toward the stage. The sound of her shoes on the floor echoed in the quiet hall. People whispered to each other. Some smiled mockingly, already expecting to be entertained by her failure. Others seemed genuinely curious. The lights above the piano glowed warmly as she approached it. She stopped for a moment and looked at the keys. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. She sat down slowly, adjusted the bench, and let her fingers rest lightly on the keys. For a second, no one spoke. The hall was silent except for the faint sound of glasses clinking in the back. The woman closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Inside her mind, she remembered her first piano. Old, worn out, but loved deeply. She remembered the lessons, the laughter of children she had taught, the sound of rain tapping on the window while she played for her husband during his long illness. Each memory floated around her like soft notes waiting to be heard again. She didn't start playing yet. Instead, she smiled faintly as if sharing a secret with herself. Then she whispered something under her breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. The guests leaned forward. Some held their phones up, ready to record. They were expecting something funny, something they could later tell their friends about. But at that very moment, something about the air in the room changed. The way she sat, the way her fingers hovered above the keys, and it was no longer a joke. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were all about to witness something they didn't expect. And as she took another deep breath, her fingers finally pressed the first note. The first note rose softly like a whisper in the still air. Then another followed, gentle but certain, as if her fingers had remembered a language her heart never forgot. The sound floated through the hall, echoing off the walls, filling every corner with something pure and calm. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The laughter, the chatter, even the sound of glasses stopped. She closed her eyes as she played. Her hands moved slowly at first, uncertain, as if testing if the piano would still listen to her after all these years. But soon the rhythm returned, graceful, flowing, full of feeling. Her body relaxed and her fingers began to dance across the keys. It was no longer about the people watching or the lights shining on her. It was just her and the music together again. The melody she played wasn't loud or showy. It was soft, emotional, almost like a conversation. Every note carried a piece of her story, her struggles, her memories, her hopes that never completely died. The song rose and fell like waves, pulling the listeners into a quiet world she had built from pain and love. The guests who had laughed earlier now stood completely still. Some leaned forward without even realizing it. The man who had made the first joke about her looked confused, then embarrassed. He couldn't believe the music coming from her hands. It wasn't something you heard at parties. It was something that made your heart pause for a moment. One of the older women in the audience closed her eyes as the song went on. The melody reminded her of something long forgotten, maybe her childhood, maybe someone she loved once. A young boy standing beside her stopped moving and just listened, his mouth slightly open. Even the hotel staff near the door had stopped their work to watch. The woman at the piano didn't look at anyone. Her fingers kept moving as tears slowly gathered in her eyes. She wasn't sad, it was something deeper, something only she could understand. Each note was a piece of her life being brought back to light, something she had buried years ago because life left her no choice. She played a tune she once wrote herself, a song she had created many years earlier when things were simpler. Back then she used to play it for her husband when he came home tired. He would sit near the window with tea in his hands, smiling softly as she played. It was their song, filled with warmth and quiet understanding. As the music filled the room, that memory returned to her so clearly she could almost see him sitting there again, listening. The weight she carried for so long, the endless work, the exhaustion, the loneliness, all of it melted into the melody. And then, something beautiful happened. One by one, the people in the room began to feel what she felt. The song spoke to them without words. It reminded them of their own forgotten dreams, of kindness, of loss, of love that had faded with time. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, the air in the hall had completely changed. The same guests who had mocked her now stood silent, their eyes following her hands. A few whispered quietly, "Who is she? How does she play like that?" But no one dared interrupt. The host of the event stood near the back of the room, amazed. He had seen many performers before, trained musicians, famous artists, but none had ever played like this. There was no stage act here, no performance for attention. It was raw, honest, and full of soul. When the melody softened again, a small sound broke the silence. A quiet sob from somewhere in the back. A woman had covered her face, moved by the music. Another man wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one noticed. The pianist herself felt nothing but peace. For the first time in years, she was free from everything, from fear, from judgment, from her past. The piano gave her a voice again. As the song neared its end, her fingers slowed, touching the final notes like she was saying goodbye to something precious. The last sound lingered in the air for a long second before fading completely. And then, silence. No one moved. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, heavy and deep. The woman kept her eyes closed, her hands resting on the keys. She didn't want to open them yet. She wanted to hold on to that feeling for just a little longer. Then, slowly, the sound of clapping began. Soft at first from one corner, then spreading around the room. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. People stood up cheering, clapping louder and louder. Some even whistled. It was not just appreciation, it was respect, admiration, and apology all at once. The woman opened her eyes, blinking in disbelief. She looked around and saw faces she hadn't dared look at before. Some were smiling with tears, others nodding toward her with warmth. The same man who had laughed at her earlier now clapped the hardest, his face red with embarrassment but full of awe. She stood slowly, gave a small bow and whispered, "Thank you." The host walked toward her, still clapping. "That was unbelievable," he said softly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She smiled faintly. "I used to teach," she said. "A long time ago." The host looked surprised. "You taught? That explains it. You're incredible." She shook her head. "No, I just loved it. Life made me stop, but I guess some things never really leave you." People began coming closer, eager to talk to her. A few guests apologized for their earlier behavior. One woman said, "I feel ashamed for laughing before. You played beautifully." It touched me. The woman smiled kindly. "It's all right. Sometimes we don't see people fully until they show us a part of themselves." Someone asked if she had written the piece herself. She nodded. "Yes, it was a song I made for my husband," she said softly. "He used to say it made our small home feel like a palace." The crowd fell quiet again. The simplicity of her words touched them more than anything else could. As people continued to speak to her, she noticed a few hotel workers watching from the back with pride. They had seen her every day, sweeping floors, arranging tables, carrying trays, but tonight they saw her differently. The host offered her a seat at one of the tables, but she refused politely. "Thank you," she said. "I should get back to work." But the host smiled and said, "Not tonight. Tonight you're our guest." The other guests agreed, urging her to stay. They wanted to hear more about her, but she didn't talk much about herself. She just sat quietly, grateful and shy, smiling as they praised her. One man from the local music school came forward. He said softly, "We're holding a small charity concert next month. Would you consider performing? People need to hear you play, she was surprised. Me? She asked. Yes, he said warmly. You have something rare. Your music comes from the heart. She hesitated. The idea scared her, but it also made her heart flutter. It had been so long since she felt this kind of joy, not pride, but a gentle spark that made life feel bright again. That night, as the event ended, many guests came to shake her hand. A few even asked for her contact information. The same people who once ignored her now looked at her with admiration. When the hall finally emptied and the lights dimmed, she sat alone at the piano once more. The echoes of applause still filled her mind. She touched the keys again, this time quietly, just for herself. The melody she played now was simple, just a few notes, slow and soft. But it carried something powerful, the feeling that maybe even after years of silence it was never too late to be heard again. She closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long time she felt proud, not because of the applause but because she had been brave enough to be herself again. Outside, the night was calm. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets, and a cool breeze passed through the open doors of the hall. As she walked out, the sound of her footsteps mixed with the faint echo of her tune still playing in her mind. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing. She would never let music leave her again. The night after the event, she could hardly sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the applause echoing in her ears. It felt unreal. She had gone there only to work and earn her daily wage, but she left with her heart full for the first time in years. She sat by her small window, watching the quiet street outside. The city lights reflected on the wet road after the rain, and every sound felt distant. She thought about how life had changed in just one evening. People who hadn't even looked at her before now saw her differently. But it wasn't their applause that stayed in her mind. It was that moment when her fingers touched the piano keys, when she felt alive again. She smiled softly to herself. Maybe music never really leaves you, she whispered. The next morning, she woke up early as usual. Her hands were tired, but her heart was light. She put on her uniform and went back to work at the hotel. Everything looked the same, the tables, the flowers, the busy staff, but she felt different inside. As she entered the hall, one of the waiters smiled at her. Everyone's still talking about last night, he said. You really surprised them. She laughed quietly. I didn't mean to surprise anyone, she said. I just wanted to play. Later that day, the event manager called her into his office. He wasn't someone who usually spoke to the workers much. When she walked in, he stood up and smiled kindly. I wanted to thank you for what you did last night, he said. The guests were impressed. Some of them even called me this morning asking about you. She was taken aback. About me? Yes, he said. They want to know your story. Some want you to perform at their private gatherings. I think you should consider it. She hesitated. I haven't performed in years, she said quietly. I'm not even sure I can anymore. The manager shook his head. You can. Everyone saw it. You have something special. Don't hide it again. Those words stayed with her all day. Even when she returned home that evening, they echoed in her mind. She sat on her small bed, holding a cup of tea, thinking deeply. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been hiding from life for too long. That weekend, she decided to visit an old music shop she used to go to years ago. It was a small place at the corner of a quiet street, filled with the smell of old wood and sheet music. When she walked in, the shopkeeper, a kind elderly man, looked up and smiled. It's been a long time, he said. I didn't expect to see you again, she smiled back. I didn't expect to come, she replied. But I missed this place. She ran her fingers across the piano keys displayed in the store. The sound was soft and familiar. Do you still give lessons here? She asked. The shopkeeper nodded. Sometimes. Not as many as before. Why do you ask? I want to start playing again, she said after a pause. Not for money. Just for myself, the man smiled warmly. That's the best reason to play. He offered to let her use the piano in the back room whenever she wanted. She thanked him, her heart swelling with gratitude. That small kindness meant more than he could imagine. From that day, she started visiting the shop every evening after work. At first, her fingers were stiff and her timing felt off. But little by little, the old rhythm returned. The piano became her escape, her little corner of peace after long, tiring days. Sometimes children from the neighborhood would come and watch her through the glass window. They didn't know who she was, but they loved listening. One of them once shouted, "Play the happy one again," and she laughed, playing a cheerful tune that made everyone outside smile. Weeks passed. Her confidence grew quietly, like sunlight sneaking through a window after a long winter. Then one afternoon she received a letter delivered to the hotel. It was an invitation from one of the guests who had attended the charity event. He ran a local cultural center and wanted her to perform at a small community concert. She read the letter several times. Her first thought was fear. What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess up? But then she remembered how it felt that night, sitting at the piano not caring about judgment or mistakes. She smiled and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do." She accepted the invitation. In the weeks that followed, she practiced every evening at the shop. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine the audience in front of her, not as critics but as hearts waiting to feel something. The shopkeeper often stood quietly nearby, listening with a proud smile. "You play like you're talking to someone," he told her once. She nodded. "Maybe I am," she said softly. When the day of the concert finally came, she stood backstage feeling nervous. The hall was small, nothing fancy, but it was filled with people, families, students, and a few of the same guests from the charity night. As she waited for her turn, she touched her necklace, a small pendant her husband had given her years ago. It reminded her of why she started playing in the first place, to share love, not to prove anything. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage slowly. The audience clapped politely, not knowing much about her. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The moment her fingers touched the keys, all the fear disappeared. The melody flowed easily, like it had been waiting all this time. The sound was clear, tender, and full of life. People listened quietly, caught in the emotion that poured out of her. She didn't play for perfection. She played from memory, from heart, from every quiet moment she had lived through. Her song told a story of a woman who lost everything yet found her voice again. When the last note faded, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was warm, not loud. It was the kind that came from genuine admiration. A few children ran toward the stage, smiling. One of them handed her a small flower and said, "That was beautiful." Her eyes softened as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. After the concert, people came to talk to her again. This time she didn't feel shy. She laughed, she shared small stories, and she listened to others. Someone asked if she would give piano lessons to local kids. She thought for a moment, then smiled. "Yes," she said, "I'd love to." That evening, as she walked home, the air was cool and the city lights shimmered. She carried the flower the little boy had given her. It was just a small white flower, but it meant more than any prize could. When she reached home, she placed it beside a picture of her husband and whispered, "I did it." In the days that followed, her life began to change in quiet ways. People started recognizing her in the community. Children came to her for lessons. The hotel staff treated her with new respect. She was still humble, still kind, still the same woman who once cleaned tables. But now her eyes carried something new: pride and peace. Music returned to her life not as a dream, but as a purpose. Every time she sat at the piano, she felt grateful, not for fame or attention, but for the chance to feel alive again. One evening, after finishing a lesson with a young girl, she stayed behind to play a soft tune. The shopkeeper listened and said, "You know, you've become the soul of this place." She laughed gently. "No," she said. "Music is the soul. I just finally remembered how to listen." As she walked home under the quiet sky, she thought about everything that had happened. It amazed her how one small moment, a simple decision to sit at a piano, could change everything. She had once believed her best days were behind her. Now she understood that life doesn't end when dreams are paused. Sometimes it just waits. For the right time, the right courage, the right song. That night, before going to bed, she sat by the window again. The same streetlight flickered outside, but she didn't feel lonely anymore. She looked at her hands, the same hands that once scrubbed tables and now created music again. She whispered softly, "Thank you, life, and for giving me another chance." And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of her new chapter, That night she could hardly sleep. Even with her eyes closed, she kept hearing the sound of the piano keys and the soft clapping that followed. The applause was gentle, but it carried warmth she hadn't felt for years. She lay awake thinking how strange it was that a single moment could change so much. She had gone to work expecting an ordinary shift and ended up finding a part of herself she thought was gone forever. When morning light slipped through the thin curtains, she rose quietly. The city outside was waking too. She brewed a small cup of tea and sat by the window of her tiny room. The air smelled of rain and dust. She watched people rushing to buses, school children laughing, shopkeepers opening their doors. Life looked the same, but something in her heart had shifted. She touched her fingers lightly, still amazed that they could remember the music after so many silent years. At the hotel that day, everything buzzed as usual. Plates clinked, staff hurried across the hall, and guests came and went. Yet she noticed how people looked at her differently now. Some smiled, some nodded politely, and one of the waiters whispered, "Everyone's still talking about last night." She gave a small laugh. "Let them talk," she said. "I just did what felt right." In the afternoon, the event manager called her to his office. His tone was kinder than she had ever heard before. "You have talent," he told her. "Several guests asked about you. They want to invite you to their gatherings. You should think about it." She hesitated. "I haven't played seriously in years." "Then maybe it's time you started again," he replied. She thanked him and returned to her work, but his words followed her the whole day. On her walk home, she passed a small music store she used to visit when life was easier. The front window still displayed a few old instruments. For a moment she just stood there, remembering the smell of polished wood and paper, remembering laughter that used to fill her house. Then, on an impulse, she went inside. The bell above the door rang softly. The owner, an old man with kind eyes, looked up and smiled in surprise. "It's been years," he said. She nodded shyly. "I wanted to see if you still have a piano in the back room." He led her there, and when she pressed the first key, the sound filled the tiny space. It was a little out of tune, but beautiful all the same. She felt tears sting her eyes. "Would it be all right if I come here sometimes after work?" she asked. "Just to practice?" "Of course," he said. Music should never stay silent. From that day on, she came almost every evening. She played quietly, not for anyone else but herself. At first her fingers felt stiff, but soon the notes began to flow again. Children from the street sometimes peeked through the window to watch her, giggling when she smiled at them. One night a little girl asked, "Can you play something happy?" She laughed and played a lively tune that made everyone outside dance for a minute before running off. Weeks passed, and her heart grew lighter. The heaviness she had carried for years began to fade, replaced by a calm confidence. Then one morning she received a letter at the hotel. It was printed on simple white paper, but the message made her hands shake. A man who had attended the charity event was organizing a community concert and wanted her to perform. Her first thought was fear. What if she wasn't ready? What if she made mistakes? But then she remembered the feeling of that first night, the peace she found in those few minutes of music. She smiled and whispered, "Why not?" The old shopkeeper was thrilled when she told him. "You will touch people's hearts again," he said. "That's all that matters." So she practiced each day after work. She didn't chase perfection. She only tried to be honest in every note. Sometimes she played softly as rain tapped against the windows. Sometimes she played bright songs that made the small shop feel alive again. When the concert day arrived, she dressed simply, as she always did. The hall was small but filled with families, children, and neighbors. Some of the same people from the charity event were there too. Backstage, she took a deep breath and looked at her hands. They trembled slightly, but not from fear, from excitement. When her name was called, she walked out to polite applause and sat down at the piano. The lights felt warm on her face. She closed her eyes, took one slow breath, and began. The first melody was gentle and clear. The hall grew quiet. The notes told stories of love, loss, and second chances. Every sound came straight from her heart. She wasn't performing. She was speaking without words. As the song built, people leaned forward in their seats. A few wiped their eyes. By the time the final note faded, the silence was thick with emotion. Then came the applause, loud, full, sincere. She smiled shyly, stood and bowed. A small boy ran up and handed her a single white flower. "That was beautiful," he said softly. She bent down and thanked him, her eyes shining. After the show, several people surrounded her. Some wanted lessons, others simply wanted to shake her hand. One woman said, "You reminded me that it's never too late to start again." Those words touched her more than anything. As she left the hall that night, the cool wind brushed her face. She carried the little flower carefully all the way home. She placed it beside an old framed photo of her husband and whispered, "I hope you heard me tonight." From then on, life began to bloom slowly but surely. Children from the neighborhood started coming to her for piano lessons. She taught them patiently, laughing when they hit the wrong notes and cheering when they got them right. Parents thanked her for bringing music into their homes again. Even at the hotel, everyone treated her differently. She was still humble, still helped with small chores, but people now looked at her with respect. The event manager once said, "You remind us that talent can live anywhere." She smiled and answered, "Talent is nothing without kindness." In the evenings after teaching, she often stayed behind at the music shop to play for herself. The old owner would sit quietly in a chair, eyes closed, listening. One night he told her, "You've become the heart of this place." She laughed gently. "Maybe music is the heart," she said. "I just finally learned to listen to it again." Her days no longer felt heavy. The world hadn't changed much, but she had. Every morning she woke with a purpose, and every night she went to bed with gratitude. She didn't dream of fame or riches. She simply wanted to keep sharing the peace she had found. Sometimes she thought about that first night at the hotel, when people laughed at her. She didn't feel anger anymore. In a strange way, she was thankful for it. Without that moment, she might never have rediscovered her voice. One evening, while closing the shop, she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was the same boy who had given her the white flower. "Will you play one more song?" he asked shyly. She smiled and sat at the piano. The tune she played was gentle, full of hope. The boy sat on the floor listening, eyes wide. When she finished, he said, "I want to learn to play like you." She looked at him kindly. "Then you will," she said. "All you need is patience and heart." He nodded seriously, as if he had just been told a great secret. She knew then that music had started another circle, one that would continue long after her. That night, as she walked home beneath a sky full of stars, she felt lighter than ever. The city noises faded behind her, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her own footsteps. She thought about everything that had led her here, the struggles, the silence, the rediscovery. It all made sense now. When she reached her little room, she placed her hands on the windowsill and looked out. Somewhere in the distance, she could still hear faint sounds of life, laughter, traffic, someone playing a radio. She smiled. Life was ordinary again, yet filled with extraordinary moments. She whispered softly into the still air, "Thank you for not letting me give up." Then she turned off the light and let the calm of the night wrap around her, the echo of her music still gently alive inside her heart. The years that followed moved gently, like a quiet song that never truly ended. The woman who once worked in silence had now become someone people turned to for comfort and guidance. Her music had slowly woven its way through the small town, finding its place in hearts that had forgotten how to listen. Each morning still began the same, a cup of tea by the window, sunlight spilling into her small room. But now there was something different about those mornings. There was peace. She didn't feel the emptiness that used to sit heavy in her chest. Instead, she felt calm, knowing that she had found purpose again. At the shop, more and more people came to see her play. Some came after a long day just to sit quietly and listen. Others brought their children, hoping the melodies would inspire them to dream. It amazed her how music could do that, how a few notes could bring strangers together and make them feel like family. She never called herself a teacher, but she had become one. Every child who came to her learned not just how to press the keys, but how to feel the music. "Don't rush," she often said. "Let the song tell you what it wants to say." Her lessons were full of laughter and patience. Even when a child hit a wrong note, she smiled softly and said, "That's how music teaches us, by showing what doesn't fit, so we can find what does." One afternoon, a letter arrived at the shop. It was from the same event manager who had once given her that first chance at the hotel. He had heard about her little music group and wanted to invite her and her students to perform at the city's annual community fair. She hesitated at first. The city fair was much bigger than anything they had ever done. But when she told the children, their eyes shone with excitement. Please say yes, one of them begged. We want to show everyone what we can do. She couldn't refuse that kind of hope. So she agreed. For weeks they practiced after school. The small room at the shop echoed with music every evening. She worked with each child patiently, helping them find confidence in every note. The old shopkeeper often watched from the doorway, smiling as the children filled the space with laughter and sound. When the day of the fair finally came, they all traveled to the city together. The children wore simple clothes but carried their instruments proudly. The woman felt a familiar nervousness as they stepped onto the stage, yet she also felt something stronger: pride. As they began to play, the crowd grew quiet. The melodies were pure and full of heart. You could see it in the children's faces. They weren't performing for applause. They were sharing something true. When the last note faded, the applause that followed was overwhelming. People stood clapping and cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. After the performance, many came forward to thank them. A reporter asked for a short interview, and she spoke simply. "We're not here to show off. We just want people to remember that beauty still lives in small moments." Her words touched many. The story of the woman who once worked quietly in a hotel and was laughed at before playing a beautiful tune began to spread again. But this time it spread as an inspiration. People talked about how she found her courage, how she used her gift to bring others together. Weeks later, letters began to arrive from nearby towns asking if she could visit to teach, or perform, or simply speak to young musicians. She never sought fame, but she agreed to some visits because she wanted others to believe in their second chances too. Everywhere she went, she met people who had stopped chasing their dreams because life had been too hard. She told them her story, not as a tale of success, but as a reminder that healing takes time and courage. "The world might forget you," she would say softly, "but you should never forget yourself." Her words had power because they came from a real place. She didn't talk about perfection. She talked about persistence. Back home, the little shop became more than just a place for music. It turned into a gathering space for the community. On weekends, people brought food, shared stories, and took turns singing or playing. Some evenings, old couples danced slowly in the middle of the room while the children played light tunes. Laughter mixed with music and the air felt alive. The old shopkeeper often looked at her and said, "You brought life back to this place." She always shook her head with a smile. "Music did," she would answer. "I only followed it." One evening, as the day faded into a golden sunset, she sat at the piano alone. Her fingers rested on the keys, but she didn't play right away. Instead, she thought about her journey, the pain, the laughter, the second chances. She realized that even though her life hadn't been easy, every step had brought her to this moment. Finally, she began to play. The tune was new, something she had never played before. It was soft and full of peace, like a goodbye that didn't hurt. The notes floated out into the street where children chased each other, where neighbors talked and laughed. It felt as if the whole town breathed in that song together. When she finished, she looked up and saw the boy who had once given her a white flower standing by the door. He was older now, taller, carrying his own small keyboard. He smiled shyly. "You remember me?" he asked. She nodded with warmth in her eyes. "Of course I do. I kept my promise," he said proudly. "I practiced every day. I want to play something for you." He sat beside her, his hands trembling slightly, and began to play. The tune was simple but beautiful. She watched, feeling tears rise again, not of sadness but of pure joy. When he finished, she clapped softly and said, "You played from your heart. That's the most beautiful kind of music there is." He grinned, his eyes shining. "I learned that from you." That moment stayed with her for a long time. It made her realize that music, like kindness, never really ends. It travels from one person to another, changing shape but never losing its warmth. Years later, when her hair had turned silver and her steps had slowed, she still played every evening. Sometimes her fingers missed a note, but she didn't mind. Each mistake reminded her that she was still alive, still learning. The shop walls were now covered with photos of her students, of performances, of smiling faces. Some of the children she once taught had grown up and become teachers themselves. They often came back to visit, bringing their students along. The room would fill with laughter and sound, just as it had all those years ago. One night after everyone had left, she sat alone again at the piano. Outside, the world was quiet. She touched the keys gently and began to play the same song she had played the first night people laughed at her. But this time there was no pain in it. Only gratitude.